we talked a little bit about sort of say the general findings of the scrolls. I want to get you into what's actually in the scrolls. Because people say the scrolls, the scrolls, the scrolls, but actually what's in them. Very few people actually have read them and are familiar with the content. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview. First of all, when we're talking scrolls, when we say scrolls, it's a little bit deceiving, okay? And here's why it's deceiving. Because we're not talking about actual scrolls. We do have some scrolls that are more or less intact. Most of what we have is a bunch of fragments, okay? Partial sentences. You'd have a piece of a scroll where the sentence goes, and there you go. It's just the middle of a sentence. You don't know what came before, you don't know what came after. It's a unique text you've never seen before. You don't know, you have to guess. And so there's a lot of reconstruction that happens. And so these are the little tiny partial scrolls. When you get a little piece like that, you don't know where it came from. There's no directions, no assembly. You know, it's like you have to figure this out. That's why I explained that it took scholars so long to kind of put these things together.
They could have sped through this. They could have taken these and just given this to a senior home, and they would have been able to. They would have been able to just put them together in no time.
Give it to the puzzle masters. Yes, yes, that's true. That's true. But you know, it made the process, you know, complicated and long and tedious. Very, very difficult venture to put all these puzzle pieces together. But basically, that's what we're talking about. So when we're talking about Dead Sea Scrolls, we're actually talking about a very broad collection of texts. And when I mean broad, there's all sorts of things in there. One of the categories that's found in Qumran is what we call the biblical fragments. So these are the sections from the actual books of the Bible. And they found all the books of the Bible, like the canon as you know it, all books except the book of Esther. Now people make a big deal about why is the book of Esther not there. Now you got to remember, number one, there was no such thing as canon, so we're just lucky that we actually have all these books represented in there. They found many other books too, and people say, oh, they didn't like Esther, or didn't like the book of Esther, or it's not enough about Israel in Esther, or whatever. There's all kinds of hypotheses why Esther is not there. That somehow the Qumranites really didn't like Esther or something like that. Yeah. Nothing like it. I just imagine the jar with Esther didn't survive or something like that. Just imagine that. We have little bits and pieces, sometimes only one sentence from a particular book of the Bible. That's all we have. And so the only book that is not represented in the whole collection out of the canon that you know is the book of Esther. But I think it's just really a coincidence and nothing sort of say malicious about it. Now, some texts were written in Paleo-Hebrew script. I don't know if you know what Paleo-Hebrew looks like. It's not exactly the Hebrew you're used to. It's kind of a lot of scribbles and sticks. And not quite as pretty, not quite as stylized. Some were in Aramaic, okay? You're familiar with Aramaic translations of the Hebrew Bible. Well, some scrolls that were found actually were not Hebrew, they were Aramaic. They were translations of the Hebrew. Some of the texts that were found were mezuzot. There was lots and lots of mezuzot that they found, and lots of passages that came from tefillin, okay? From the little boxes that are strapped to your body. And so these are particular texts, and then guess what? They actually haven't changed. It's the same exact text that people used back then. Very minor variations. Now, another category of text that was found at Qumran is the extra-biblical fragments. And I call that extra-biblical because we are accepting the idea of canon and Bible, you know, but so anything outside of that we would call extra-biblical, okay? So these were portions of the books such as Ben Sirach, for example, the Wisdom of Sirach, or the Book of Tobit, or the Epistle of Jeremiah, various types of midrashim on various passages, paraphrases of all sorts. There were texts that were biblical paraphrases, like the paraphrase of the Book of Genesis, done kind of like, you know, Good News Bible style or something like that. You know, that, and there were a lot of calendar calculations, a lot of like calendaric, you know, texts that try to figure out what happened when and which month and which day and things like that all throughout the Bible. So a lot of texts that we call extra biblical. That means they're sort of kind of around the Bible, but not exactly, you know, coming from the text that you know as canonical. Now, other documents that were found in Qumran were sectarian documents. We call that also hypothetically sectarian documents. What we mean is that these are documents unique only to the Qumranite people, to the community of Qumran. We're not going to find those books anywhere else. So if the book of Tobit was read by a bunch of folks in Jerusalem, if the Epistle of Jeremiah is known to people in Galilee, guess what? These texts are totally internal. They're only belonging to that group of people in community. Nobody else knows about them. They're their unique writings, okay? And so what are you going to find in there? Their books are going to be like the eschatological Pesher, the commentaries. I already showed you a Pesher, how Pesher is a commentary that says, well, this is what the prophet said, but in our days, this is what is happening. This is the fulfillment. This is the passage, this is the fulfillment. It's always about what's happening today in our days. There were a lot of halakhic texts, legal texts, texts explaining all sorts of commandments and how to keep that commandment, how to best obey the Lord, in regards to that particular commandment. There were a lot of prayers and liturgical texts. There were actually entire liturgies that were found in Qumran. Psalms written with angelic praise, like very similar to the Kiddusha that we sing, things like that. There were also wisdom teachings, kind of like the book of Proverbs, where wisdom calls out to you in the streets and it tells you, listen to me, my son, do this, don't do that, kind of text. So a lot of those. And a lot of internal Qumran community rules. These are like bylaws of their community, who gets admitted, how long do they have to wait, what hoops do they have to jump through to join the community, and how do they get kicked out, how do they get disciplined, and so on and so forth. So a lot of internal rules. So all of these we call sectarian documents, or documents that belong particularly to the Qumranites. They're unique just to them alone. And so besides the biblical and the extra-biblical and the sectarian documents, there's a whole group of documents that we call the other texts, simply because we don't know what to call them. And the truth is that the area of Qumran was inhabited by people throughout ages. Qumranites weren't the only people who lived there. And there's evidence of other people who dwelt on the site that they left behind, okay? So there were other caves beside the Qumran caves. For example, Masada. They found texts of Masada. They don't belong to the Qumran community. They're not technically Qumranite, but we kind of group them into the Dead Sea Scrolls because they're found in that general vicinity, in that general area, okay? So for example, one of the caves that they were exploring in there, they found what is known today as the Bar Kokhba letters, okay? Israeli archaeologists actually found of letters that are written by Bar Kokhba that were meant to be sent out to people in different places where he tells them what to do and how to solve their disputes, and he's acting in a sense like a judge, like a magistrate of the community by providing guidance in all sorts of legal matters and all sorts of disputes that might happen. So he's a leader. So these are like his letters to his people within his community, to other Jews that are in different places in Israel, in various locations. So, yes, go ahead.
So Bar Kokhba, who was a messianic type figure after the time of Yeshua,
right?
Actually, after the time of the destruction of the Second Temple.
Right, 2nd century, yeah.
Okay, so he functioned in and around the Dead Sea area.
They hid out. Remember the rebels hid out on Masada. Mm-hmm. Remember the first Jewish revolt, it ends at Masada, right? Okay. So that area becomes a place of the revolutionaries. So if I'm going to have a second revolt against Rome, one of the best places to hide in a bunch of caves in the middle of dry, arid desert where these Romans they don't know it, they don't know how to get to me, they don't have water supplies, it's a very tough place for warfare. So if you're going to fight a guerrilla warfare, it is the best place to fight in places like the Dead Sea region.
That's a really good place. So it's like if you're a revolutionary, that's a great place to be.
Absolutely. And there's a few, it's like in Afghanistan. It's like the Afghanis hiding out in all those caves, and there's no way we're going to ever smoke them out because we don't know the terrain. They know every cave. Yeah. They grew up there, and that's... So same thing. If you want to fight the guerrilla warfare, that's what you do. You run to the hills. And you see that in the Bible a lot, about running to the hills, right? Guess what? That's what it literally means. And Jews have done that historically throughout the entire history. People ran to the hills. When people wanted to fight against Romans in Galilee, where do you think they ran? They ran to the hills. Mount Arbel today has all these caves and caverns where people were hiding out. And the Romans literally built these contraptions to lower themselves into the caves to take out the Jewish rebels. I mean, it's like they repelled, you know, they lowered their equipment down. It's because people would hide out in the caves forever, and they'd have food and all sorts of things stored up in there, and they could hold out for a long time. So Bar Kokhba was holding out in that same area, and they found evidence of his letters, you know, his directions that he's sending out. So when I say other texts, these are texts that don't necessarily have anything to do with Qumran community per se, but they're found in that same area in the process of searching. They may belong to a different era, completely different time. They were texts that were found in Arabic, okay? You know, Quranic texts. They were texts that came from Byzantine Christians. They were found in that same area, because guess what? The caves are caves. If I want to hang out in the cave, if I'm like some monk and I want to live in the cave and I have a few manuscripts with me, I'm going to leave them behind if something happened, and some archaeologists years later are going to find it. You'd be surprised. There's all sorts of texts that were there that don't really have anything with Qumran Jews. So we just call them other texts, and they're grouped within the collection per se. And they become part of that heritage. Now, let me tell you something about the text of the Torah. This is something that we learned as scientists, as researchers, about the text of the Torah, because the Qumran scrolls are the oldest versions of the Torah we have. We don't have any older manuscripts than the Qumran manuscripts when it comes to Torah. It's it. So
what was the, before we found?
Before Qumran. Right, so Qumran Torah texts date, some of them date up to like 3rd century BCE. Okay, that's how old we're talking about. So imagine, that's not a scroll that Qumranites wrote, it's a scroll they preserved.
Yeah.
It's before them, they carried it with them, they preserved it there, and we found it. So we have fragments of scrolls that are probably from about 300 years BCE.
So we're talking 2,400 years old.
You got it.
Okay,
Now,
ish.
imagine, 2,300 years old, let's say. But then the next oldest scrolls we have is 5th century of the Common Era. So we're talking 3rd, 4th, 5th century, that we don't have anything older than that. So imagine that now we have is about 600 years worth of difference between, we've just gone back 600 years.
Yeah, yeah.
That's what happened by discovering scrolls in Qumran. We have acquired evidence that's 600 years older than the oldest evidence we have, which is pretty awesome. So that's why these scrolls are so important. And so when they studied the text of the Torah, what they found is they found all sorts of ideas. They found pre-Masoretic Hebrew text. So you're familiar with the Torah text that we read today is called the Masoretic text. It was put together by the scribes, okay? But these are pre-Masoretic. We found pre-Septuagint text. Septuagint is a translation of Torah into Greek that was done in the 2nd century BCE. Well, guess what? We found a Hebrew text that looks like the source from which Septuagint was translated, but it's actually not the same as Masoretic. It's different. It's a different family of the Bible, okay? And then we found also Proto-Samaritan texts as well that look a lot like the Samaritan Torah. So remember, this is a collection. This is a library. They have all sorts of scrolls and books there.
So
Yes.
you've been finding these things like in the same general area.
Yes.
And they're different ages.
Yes.
And I was just thinking that was a library, and you said.
That's
that.
exactly what it is.
So,
Think
yeah.
of this library all of a sudden getting forgotten.
Right.
And then thousands of years later, somebody walks in and they find all these books. What are they going to find in this library? They're going to find Torahs, they're going to find Sidurs, they're going to find Talmud, they're going to find Midrash, they're going to find all sorts of commentary literature. And that's exactly what we found. We found somebody else's library.
Yeah.
And we found a variety of books. But, you know, they're going to be different translations of the Torah that we're going to have here, right?
Right.
And that's what we're finding. We're finding different versions of the Torah because it wasn't fixed yet.
Your point is so key in that library we find, it's 600 years older than any library.
Than any other library we have, exactly. That's the value. Yes, David?
I think you just answered my question. I was trying to get you to define what do you mean by family? The difference these were Torah scrolls that are families.
They're families. Imagine you have a text and you want to preserve that text, so you keep copying that text because that's the text how it came down to you. You don't dare change it because it's old, it's ancient, it's worth preserving. And another scribe finds another version of the text and they keep preserving that text. And it's not up to them to decide which text is the correct one.
Right.
Their job is just to copy and preserve it. And so what we find is we find different versions of the same text. It's the same story, but it has slightly different wordings. There are some words missing here, some words added there. And we don't know which one is right because they're all ancient, you know, and these are different versions that come down to us which essentially what it tells us, it tells us something important, that these texts were still in flux. There were still changes undergoing. There was not one version of the Torah that everybody went to and said, this is it. There were slight variations. Different communities could have Torah that was just a tad different. Okay? Samaritan Torah is different. Septuagint is different. If you're going to read the Septuagint, it's going to read different from the Torah that you know today, because what you know is the Masoretic Torah. But imagine that there was a Torah that existed before. Like if I had to translate it into Greek, I translate it from a Hebrew version. Well, guess what? That Hebrew version, they find it there.
Question over here. Michael?
Yes, Mike.
My understanding is that a lot of variants actually come down to the spelling got updated in Babylon.
Spellings, yes.
Started using vavs and yos
Yes.
and so forth to carry vowel sounds.
Yes.
And start keeping with the with Aramaic spelling conventions. And so in many cases, what we're seeing is a lack of the vowel carrying consonants that were used to.
Yes.
And in some cases, this actually resulted in variance in text because they had to decide which vowel sound was correct.
Right.
And like for example, with the quotation of Amos in the New Testament, it says that the remnant of mankind may seek the Lord.
Right.
In the Masoretic and all the other variants we have, it's that they may possess the remnant of Eden. It's a very similar spelling. It's basically one accidentally mistranscribed letter, and someone decided to put a vav into a dom.
Exactly.
that
Yeah,
they
you
thought-
change one letter, the meaning can change, and now you have another possible interpretation of that text that now can lead you into different direction. That Hebrew does that. I mean, I'm realizing in English that doesn't work that way, but in Hebrew it does, because one letter can change the word completely. Yeah.
I believe, if I'm, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but outside of the Qumranic text, the oldest versions that we have of the Tanakh are the Geniza of like the Leningrad Codex and the
Complete versions.
Yeah, complete versions. The
Yes.
Leningrad Codex and the Aleppo. And that's from the medieval period.
Mhm. Yes.
One of the things, I guess, key features I noticed in differences, like the Psalms, for example, in the Qumranic text are much more messianic
Yes.
than the Psalms that are in the medieval Leningrad
That's right.
Codex.
That's right.
And like, they lioned at my hands and feet.
Yes.
You know, not they pierced my hand. They lioned at my hands and feet. It's very awkward.
Yes.
It's like I don't know if maybe you could. Speak
Well, there's actually a
Yeah.
textual variant in the Dead Sea Scrolls that's different from
Yeah.
the Leningrad Codex, is different from the Aleppo Codex. If
Yeah.
you're talking about that particular psalm, there is a variant.
Well, yeah, but it's a very convenient. Very.
Everyone has
Piercings,
there's tiny little differences, but I
Yeah.
mean, realize it's
Yeah.
still the same stories. It's still
Sure,
the
sure,
same thing. It's just they're told with slight different inflections, a
Yeah.
little extra word there, a little extra phrase there, and sometimes it's just a different spelling.
Yeah.
So we're not talking huge differences, but we can recognize these differences. As I said, if you read Septuagint, you will see it's different from the Masoretic Torah you have.
Yeah.
It's going to have differences. Well, imagine Septuagint was translated from something. It wasn't just born in Greek. It came from a text of Torah. That means those translators used something to translate. And we found versions of the Hebrew text that match the Septuagint much more than the Masoretic text. And we say, wait a minute, that must be what they used to get the Septuagint. That's a different family of scrolls, basically. It's a different family of manuscripts. So that's what we have. And Proto-Samaritan is another one of those. So we have the Samaritan Torah, the ST, we have the Masoretic text, the MT, and the Septuagint is generally shown as LXX. If you've ever seen that LXX, that's what we mean. We mean Septuagint. That's Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. It just means 70 in Latin.
One of the things I also think that this is important to point out in the history of the world is the fact that you don't have anything like academies at this time. You don't
Right.
have universities.
No
And
universities,
so
no academies.
there's no dictionary.
No.
There's no thesaurus.
Nope.
There's no standard text that serves as the cornerstone by saying this,
Right.
these are in academic
Yeah.
rigor and peer review, none of that. And so it's allowed to be fluid.
Yes.
And it wasn't until the medieval period where we started building the university.
Systematizing it, yes,
Systematizing
absolutely.
it, that you actually had standards and things became concretized.
Yes.
And so.
Well, a lot of times what we do is we superimpose the modern standards that you and I have onto the ancient world, and that's not fair, because they have an entirely different way. So for them to have the Bible with fluidity is not a problem. You'll see this in the New Testament. Sometimes in the New Testament, the Bible is being quoted directly from the Greek version of Septuagint. Other times, it's just paraphrased, and other times it seems like it's being translated on the fly from Hebrew. There's various situations where, and that was just okay. They were fine with that. They were just happy because what they were after really is the content, not really each and every word. We get really into every letter, and like to us, it all has to match because we're so technical, we're so bookish, where they were more about content and meaning, way more than that. And so we just get too scientific. We are so, citations.
That's a Western, modern
It's very
way.
Western mind, yeah. It's very modern, very Western.
Their way of
They never thought about it that way. To them, oh, this looks like a letter missing. Let me improve this a little bit, And they're like, I'm making it better. I'm not making it worse. And they actually didn't think of it as a big deal. So sometimes these things will do. But scribes will be very careful. A lot of times if they see something is missing and something's wrong, they will write it in the margins. They'll say, I think it should be spelled that way. And it's kind of neat. We actually get their notes as well. So this is pretty cool. What I want you to realize is that we have come to realize that the Bible was much more fluid in the first century than most of us think. There's a certain flexibility, fluidity to the text themselves. And that explains why certain people quote a text one way and another person will quote the same exact text a different way. It's because they're quoting from different versions. And that's okay, because at that time they didn't have one systematized version. They weren't, isn't agreed upon yet, essentially. So a lot of this confirmed to us the understanding of how diverse Judaism was in that era. Remember, Qumran just predates the first century. The fall of Qumran just really comes around that time. They're disappearing. Their community goes into disarray in the first century. So it confirms to us the diversity of Judaism. There was a lot of disagreement. They weren't all on the same page. There were different types of Judaisms that coexisted side by side perfectly fine and didn't have a problem with it, because they all essentially were on the same page but disagreed on various issues. So when you have the Judaism of Jesus come out, and he's got his own version, and he's got his own teachings, and his own ethics, and his own priorities, it's not any different or anything revolutionary, strange, or out of the ordinary, because other people had the same type of, sort of say, movements that they have created based on what they felt was the most important part of the Torah or something like that. And Qumranites are one example of such community that prioritize certain issues over others. So it's just, these are the things that we learn.